Right now, the world is watching Pakistan, where senior U.S. and Iranian officials have arrived in Islamabad for the highest-level talks between the two countries since Iran's 1979 revolution. But the central issue is larger than diplomacy alone. These talks are taking place while a fragile two-week ceasefire remains under strain, while the Strait of Hormuz is still heavily disrupted, and while regional tensions tied to Lebanon have not yet been resolved. That matters because Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points in the world, with roughly 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas normally moving through that narrow route. So this is not only a story about whether Washington and Tehran can reduce tensions. It is also a story about shipping access, energy markets, inflation pressure, and whether regional diplomacy can keep a broader crisis from returning. Reports suggest Washington is looking for a more durable framework for de-escalation, while Iran is linking progress to issues including Lebanon and blocked assets held abroad. That is why governments, markets, and shipping interests are all watching these talks so closely. To understand why this moment matters, we first need to look at what brought both sides to the table. What is happening right now, in practical terms, is that senior U.S. and Iranian delegations have arrived in Islamabad on April 11th for direct talks aimed at reinforcing a fragile two-week ceasefire after a six-week conflict that expanded across the region and disrupted energy flows. Reuters reports that the U.S. delegation is being led by Vice President J.D. Vance, while Iran's delegation is being led by Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf. AP also reports that Pakistan is hosting and facilitating the talks, with security tightened in Islamabad and additional mediators from countries including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and China present around the process. That makes these talks unusual not only because of their timing, but also because of their level. According to Reuters, these are the highest-level U.S.-Iran talks since Iran's 1979 revolution, which immediately raises the stakes and also explains why so much attention is focused on what comes out of them. The talks are happening now because the ceasefire announced earlier this week has not resolved the main pressures created by the war. Reuters reports that shipping through the Strait of Hormuz remains severely disrupted even after the ceasefire, with only 15 ships passing through the waterway compared with a pre-conflict average of 138. That matters because the ceasefire may have slowed open confrontation, but it has not yet restored confidence in the route that carries roughly 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas. In other words, the military tempo may have changed, but the economic and logistical damage has not yet been repaired. From Washington's perspective, that makes diplomacy urgent because a ceasefire that does not stabilize Hormuz still leaves global markets exposed. From Iran's perspective, current reporting suggests these talks are a chance to convert battlefield pressure and geographic leverage into political and financial concessions. Reuters reports that Tehran has linked progress to two demands in particular: movement toward a ceasefire in Lebanon, where Israel and Hezbollah are still engaged, and access to Iranian assets frozen abroad. A separate Reuters report says an Iranian source claimed the U.S. had agreed to release some of those funds, although public confirmation from Washington and Doha had not yet been issued. That is also why expectations remain low. Both sides are entering the talks with deep distrust, unresolved disagreements over whether Lebanon is covered by the ceasefire, and different ideas about what a successful outcome would look like. Reuters reported earlier this week that Vance said the U.S. had not agreed that the ceasefire would cover Lebanon, even though that has been a central Iranian demand. So while the talks are significant, they are also narrow and fragile. They are not starting from mutual confidence. They are starting from a situation in which the fighting may have paused, but the main disputes over shipping, sanctions, Lebanon, and regional balance are still very much alive. But the talks only make sense if we understand why one narrow waterway became the center of the crisis. The Strait of Hormuz matters because it turns a regional conflict into a global systems problem. In simple terms, Hormuz is a narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, and roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes through it. That means when traffic through Hormuz slows down, the effect is not limited to the countries directly involved in the conflict. It spreads outward into shipping schedules, tanker availability, insurance pricing, refinery planning, fuel costs, and market expectations around the world. This is why the current crisis is not just another regional confrontation. It affects one of the main routes through which the global energy system functions. The logic of a choke point is straightforward. When a very large share of global supply moves through a very narrow route, even a limited disruption can create outsized effects. You do not need a total shutdown to create pressure. You only need enough uncertainty to make shipping companies slow down, insurers raise premiums, and buyers start preparing for tighter supply. Reuters reported that even after the ceasefire was announced, ship traffic through Hormuz remained near a standstill. Only 15 ships had passed through the strait since the ceasefire, compared with a pre-conflict average of 138. That tells us the problem is no longer just whether the fighting has paused. The problem is whether commercial actors believe the route is stable enough to use. This is where markets become important. Financial and energy markets do not wait for diplomacy to fully succeed before reacting. They respond to risk, and risk rises when a major shipping route becomes unpredictable. If traders think oil or liquefied natural gas shipments may be delayed, restricted, or repriced, they adjust immediately. If insurers think vessels face a higher chance of disruption, costs rise immediately. If refiners think deliveries may become less reliable, planning changes immediately. In other words, markets react to uncertainty first and clarity later. That is why a ceasefire announcement, while politically important, does not automatically calm the system. The system only begins to stabilize when ships actually move, insurance becomes manageable, and buyers regain confidence that supply flows are becoming normal again. That is also why reopening traffic matters as much as the ceasefire itself. A ceasefire can reduce immediate military pressure, but if Hormuz remains constrained, the broader economic consequences continue. Reuters described the disruption as the worst shock to global energy supplies in history, and that explains why Washington is treating the issue as urgent. The U.S. can point to diplomacy, but unless maritime traffic recovers, the core pressure point remains in place. From Iran's perspective, that same choke point creates leverage, because control over the conditions of passage affects not only military calculations, but also commercial behavior and political bargaining. So the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic location in this story, it is the mechanism through which a regional crisis becomes a global one. Once Hormuz becomes the center of the story, the next question is simple. What does each side actually want? What these negotiations are really about is not just ending a round of fighting. They are about the terms of stability afterward. From Washington's side, current reporting suggests the priority is to make the ceasefire more durable, reduce the risk of renewed escalation, and above all, restore more normal movement through the Strait of Hormuz. That matters because as long as shipping remains disrupted, the economic side of the crisis continues, even if the military tempo has slowed. Reuters and AP both described the Islamabad talks as an attempt to shore up a fragile 2-week ceasefire after a 6-week conflict that badly disrupted energy flows and raised wider concerns about inflation and supply pressure. Tehran appears to be approaching the talks from a different position. According to Reuters and AP, Iran has tied meaningful progress to 2 issues in particular: Lebanon and blocked assets. On Lebanon, Iranian officials want the diplomacy to cover Israel's operations there, not just direct U.S. Iran hostilities. On the financial side, Iran wants access to funds frozen abroad and broader movement on sanctions pressure. In that sense, Tehran does not seem to view these talks as only a ceasefire discussion. It appears to see them as a chance to convert military and geographic leverage into political and economic gains. Shipping access sits at the center of that bargaining. For Washington, success would likely mean a framework that lowers the chance of renewed confrontation and allows commercial traffic through Hormuz to begin returning toward normal. For Iran, the strait remains a source of leverage because disruption there affects markets, insurers, shipping firms, and governments far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Current reporting suggests that as long as maritime access remains uncertain, Iran retains bargaining power even while entering talks under pressure. That is one reason the negotiations are about more than statements or symbolism. They are also about who sets the conditions for normal passage through one of the world's most important energy choke points. Frozen assets and sanctions pressure are the other major part of the picture. Reuters reported that an Iranian source said the United States had agreed to unfreeze Iranian funds held in Qatar and other countries, including money linked to earlier oil sales. But public confirmation from the U.S. and Qatari governments was still limited at the time of reporting, so details remain uncertain. That uncertainty matters because if asset releases are really part of the deal, then the talks are not only about reducing military pressure, they are also about liquidity, sanctions relief, and how far Washington is willing to go to support a broader de-escalation. This also helps explain why both sides may define success differently. Washington may see a successful outcome as a ceasefire that holds, shipping that begins to recover, and enough regional restraint to stop the crisis from expanding again. Tehran may define success more in terms of concrete concessions, acknowledgement of its demands on Lebanon, access to blocked funds, and some easing of the economic pressure created by sanctions. Those are not necessarily incompatible goals, but they are not the same goals, and that gap makes the talks difficult. The final issue is trust, or more accurately, the lack of it. Reuters reported earlier this week that Vice President J.D. Vance said the U.S. had not agreed that the ceasefire would cover Lebanon, even though that has been one of Iran's central demands. Reuters also reported that Iran's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva said Tehran would approach the talks with caution because of deep mistrust. So even where there may be overlap in interests, both sides appear to doubt the other's intentions and worry about vague or disputed terms. That means the negotiations are not taking place on a foundation of confidence. They are taking place in a setting where the ceasefire is fragile, the scope of any deal remains contested, and public confirmation is still limited on some of the most sensitive issues. But there is another layer here that makes the talks much harder: Lebanon. Lebanon is part of the talks because the U.S.-Iran channel is not operating in isolation. According to Reuters, Israel and Lebanon are expected to hold separate U.S.-mediated talks in Washington, while the fighting involving Hezbollah is still active and remains one of the main pressure points in the wider crisis. That means any broader ceasefire framework is partly tied to what happens on Israel's northern front, not just to direct U.S.-Iran understandings. In practical terms, the diplomacy is now regional, not bilateral. One front affects the others, and that is why a negotiation centered on Washington and Tehran also has to account for Lebanon. The reason Tehran links Lebanon to broader de-escalation is that Lebanon is not a side issue from Iran's perspective. Reuters and AP both report that Iran has made a ceasefire in Lebanon one of its conditions for meaningful progress in Islamabad. That suggests Tehran sees the Lebanon front as part of the same strategic picture. If pressure continues on Hezbollah while U.S.-Iran talks move forward, Iran may judge that any broader arrangement is incomplete or unbalanced. Current reporting therefore suggests Iran is not looking only for a pause in direct confrontation. It is also looking for a wider reduction in regional pressure. This also explains why Israel-Lebanon diplomacy matters to the U.S.-Iran track. From Washington's perspective, a ceasefire is more likely to hold if the most active linked front can be stabilized at the same time. Reuters reports that the upcoming Washington talks are already burdened by very different agendas. Israel is treating them as part of a push to address Hezbollah's position, while Lebanon is insisting that a ceasefire comes first. That gap matters because if the Israel-Lebanon channel remains stuck, it weakens the wider attempt to show the region is moving toward lower risk. In other words, even if U.S.-Iran talks produce some movement, an unresolved northern front could still undermine confidence in the whole process. That is, the broader regional spillover at work. A 6-week conflict that began with U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran has widened into a negotiation that now touches maritime access, sanctions, blocked assets, and the future of a separate but connected battlefield in Lebanon. One unresolved front can weaken a wider deal because the parties are not negotiating over a single issue. They are trying to manage several linked pressure points at once. So even if diplomacy starts moving, the crisis is still not only political, it is also economic. The economic effects are already spreading well beyond the immediate conflict zone, and that is one reason governments are acting before the situation is fully resolved. Reuters reports that the U.S. Department of Energy has loaned another 8.48 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, making it the second such release since the war began. Reuters also reports that U.S. officials were considering extending a waiver tied to some purchases of Russian oil products in order to reduce supply stress. Those are not symbolic moves. They show that policymakers are trying to contain the market impact of the crisis, even while the diplomatic outcome remains uncertain. The reason is straightforward. When the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, the pressure moves quickly through the energy system. Oil prices react first, but the effect does not stop there. Shipping costs rise as routes become less predictable. Insurance premiums increase because vessels face higher risk. Refiners have to rethink delivery schedules and supply planning. Importing countries begin to worry about fuel availability and price pressure at home. Reuters reported that oil posted its steepest weekly loss since 2022, only after ceasefire talks raised hopes of stabilization, which shows how sensitive the market is to even small changes in perceived risk. But Reuters also reported that ship traffic through Hormuz remained heavily restricted, which means the underlying logistical problem has not yet been solved. This is also feeding into inflation pressure. Reuters reported today that higher fuel costs are already changing behavior in parts of the United States, with drivers cutting back as the war pushes gasoline prices higher. Other Reuters reporting shows central banks are also reacting more cautiously because the conflict is creating the classic mix of weaker growth and higher inflation risk. In other words, this is not just an oil market story anymore. It is starting to affect household costs, monetary policy, and business planning in multiple countries at once. The bigger concern is what happens if the disruption lasts. Reuters reports that the World Bank estimates the conflict could shave 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points off global growth, even in a best-case scenario, and as much as 1 percentage point if it drags on. That helps explain why governments are intervening early. They are not waiting for a final diplomatic settlement, because by the time that arrives, the economic damage may already be wider and more expensive to contain. At this point, the story is no longer only about diplomacy or prices. It is also about leverage. At this stage, the main question is, who actually has leverage, and what kind of leverage it is? Iran's leverage comes largely from geography and disruption. Even while under military and economic pressure elsewhere, it still sits next to the Strait of Hormuz, and that gives it influence over one of the world's most important energy routes. Reuters reports that maritime traffic through the strait remains far below normal even after the ceasefire announcement, with only 15 ships passing through compared with a pre-conflict average of 138. That matters because leverage here is not only about direct military strength, it is also about the ability to keep commercial risk elevated and force other actors to negotiate under pressure. As long as ship operators, insurers, and traders believe passage remains uncertain, Iran retains a form of influence that extends well beyond the immediate battlefield. The U.S., by contrast, has a different kind of leverage. Washington can shape sanctions policy, coordinate with partners, support maritime security, and connect several diplomatic tracks at once, including the U.S. Iran Talks and the separate Israel-Lebanon channel. It can also use energy policy tools, as shown by the recent Strategic Petroleum Reserve release and discussion of a waiver tied to some Russian oil purchases, to reduce market stress while diplomacy continues. But this is where the limits of U.S. leverage become clear. Reopening a shipping route is not only a military question, it is also a question of political terms, commercial confidence, and enforcement. Reuters reports that officials have said they expect Hormuz to reopen fairly soon, but they have not yet laid out a full public mechanism for how normal traffic would actually be restored. That gap matters because markets respond to implementation, not just intention. This is why sanctions and access are now part of the same strategic equation. Current reporting suggests Tehran is trying to convert maritime leverage into economic and political concessions, including movement on blocked assets and broader pressure points linked to sanctions. At the same time, Washington appears to be trying to convert its financial and diplomatic weight into restored shipping access and a more durable regional pause. In that sense, both sides are bargaining through systems. Iran is using uncertainty around transit and regional linkage as leverage. The U.S. is using sanctions, coalition diplomacy, and market management tools as leverage. Neither side controls the entire picture on its own, which is why the negotiations remain fragile. The other important point is that a ceasefire does not automatically restore normality. Even if military activity slows, commercial actors still need to believe the route is predictable, insurable, and unlikely to be pulled back into disruption. If that confidence does not return, shipping remains weak, insurance stays high, and the economic pressure continues. That is why Hormuz is so central to the strategic balance here. It is not just a waterway. It is the place where military pressure, diplomatic bargaining, market confidence, and regional alignment all meet. So if that is the strategic picture, what happens next? From here, there are three plausible paths, and it is important to treat them as scenarios rather than predictions. Current reporting supports all three because the talks in Islamabad are active, but the main issues, Hormuz traffic, frozen assets, sanctions pressure, and the Lebanon front, are still not fully resolved. The first scenario is limited stabilization. In that outcome, the talks produce a narrow framework that reduces immediate risk. Maritime traffic through Hormuz starts to recover gradually, and the wider crisis begins to cool, even if the deeper political disputes remain unsettled. Lebanon would likely stay difficult, but the main system under strain, energy shipping, would begin moving back toward normal. That would matter because even modest improvement in commercial traffic could lower pressure on insurers, traders, and fuel markets. Reuters and AP reporting make this scenario plausible because the talks are taking place at a very senior level and are explicitly aimed at turning the fragile ceasefire into something more durable. The second scenario is a partial deal with frozen tension. In this outcome, the ceasefire survives on paper, but the practical problems remain. Ship traffic through Hormuz stays weak, sanctions issues remain unresolved or only partly addressed, and risk pricing across shipping and energy markets stays elevated. That would mean the region avoids immediate renewed escalation, but the economic and strategic pressure continues. This may be the most realistic middle path because a pause in open conflict does not automatically restore commercial confidence. Reuters has already reported that traffic through Hormuz remains far below normal, and Reuters also reported conflicting accounts over frozen Iranian assets, with Iranian sources claiming progress while a U.S. official denied any agreement. That combination, formal diplomacy but incomplete implementation, is exactly the kind of setting in which tension can remain frozen rather than fully resolved. The third scenario is renewed escalation. In this case, the talks stall, the Lebanon front worsens, and commercial traffic fails to normalize, keeping energy pressure and diplomatic strain high. This would not necessarily mean an immediate return to full-scale conflict, but it would mean that the underlying crisis had not been contained. Reuters reports that Israel and Lebanon are expected to hold talks under U.S. mediation, but they are entering with sharply different agendas, and AP reports that fighting involving Hezbollah remains active. That matters because one unresolved regional front can weaken confidence in the entire ceasefire framework. If the diplomatic tracks start working against each other instead of reinforcing one another, then the region could move back toward a more dangerous phase. So the key point is that all three scenarios remain plausible because the current talks are trying to address several connected issues at once, not just one. They are about shipping access, sanctions, and frozen assets, regional de-escalation, and whether the Lebanon front can be prevented from undermining the wider process. So what should viewers actually watch over the next few days? The first signal is whether the talks in Islamabad produce any public framework at all. Because without a clear outline on maritime access, sanctions issues, or wider de-escalation, it will be harder for markets and commercial actors to believe the crisis is actually easing. The second signal is whether claims about frozen Iranian assets are officially confirmed. Reuters reports that Iranian sources say the United States has agreed to release some funds, but public confirmation has remained incomplete, and a U.S. official has denied that any agreement exists. So this remains one of the clearest tests of whether the talks are producing real substance or only political messaging. The third signal is whether ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz starts rising in a meaningful way. That may be the most practical indicator of all, because Reuters has reported that traffic remains far below normal even after the ceasefire, and that tells us commercial confidence has not yet returned. The fourth signal is whether the separate Israel-Lebanon track lowers pressure on the northern front, since Reuters reports that Washington is also trying to mediate talks there, while fighting involving Hezbollah remains a major source of instability. And the fifth signal is whether market interventions keep expanding, because continued releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve or other emergency steps would suggest governments still see the economic side of the crisis as unresolved. This story matters because it sits at the intersection of diplomacy, trade, energy, and military posture. If you want clear breakdowns like this, subscribe for more geopolitical analysis.